with the abundance we have because of capitalism. So we say, okay, the pro of capitalism, there's so much abundance. And we can say, well, what do you want to go back to? Sometimes when we say, if you say, well, I want something different than capitalism, someone could say, well, look at all the other forms of economy in the past. This is better than all of them. But that's not the question. The question is, given what we have now, are there ways we could go that are even better? Even if capitalism has raised, like, lowered abject suffer, decreased the amount of abject suffering in the world, given where we are now and given the current distribution of wealth, are there ways to do even better?
Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, so today I wanted to talk to you about the pros and cons of capitalism. I know that you've been very interested in this topic in the last few years and that we've had discussions on this. I wanted to know kind of how did you get your journey started questioning capitalism? What made you interested in it? And kind of walk me through that journey that you've had.
Yeah, sure. I guess to start, just defining some of the terms of the questions, like what does it even mean to question capitalism? I think the alternative to that was just not even thinking about it, taking it for granted as the way the world works. And just for some personal background, I grew up pretty comfortably middle class and eventually upper middle class. And so I never experienced problems really and with how the system could be unfair. It was like, yeah, I have, video games and able to do stuff with my family. And so just there was no starting place to even think something might be wrong. And because the system benefited me and my family. And going into college, I maybe started looking more intentionally at it, but still from a perspective of defending like the system. And so I remember reading a book and I was totally sold out to a view of economics and capitalism that we might discuss a little more here. But it was basically a book that talked about how, the market is so optimal because everyone's incentivized to do what's best for themselves. Um, that you end up with just for what's available to distribute, you end up with the optimal distribution because the people who most want it are, will pay more for it. The more people are willing to pay for it, the more people will produce it. And you kind of have that basic profit motive, the profit incentive of capitalism, right? And the argument goes that every time you intervene with those markets, you cause distortions, which actually is worse for everyone. And so if, let's say, the government tries to tax to redistribute wealth, well, now you're decreasing the profit motive for the wealthiest people, which means they aren't going to actually pursue making the stuff that is most desired. If you try to provide too many public services for free, you change the demand for certain goods. So it's this idea that anytime you disturb the market, even with good intentions, it ends up worse for everyone because you produce less stuff, there's less stuff to go around. And so there was something really appealing about that. There's like an elegance or simplicity, almost like anyone who's likes the elegance of maybe like math or physics formulas where it's like, oh wait, you can all just bring it down to one kind of variable, right? This idea of profit motive, this one principle, everything just falls into place. And if you disturb that equilibrium, it's less optimal for everyone. And so I pretty strongly believe that. Again, it's like kind of internally consistent if you like flesh out the arguments that are made for that. And the thing is that way of thinking doesn't really have a name. Like it kind of presents itself as, oh, this is just economics. And that's the first thing that kind of makes it hard to really investigate the pros and cons of capitalism is that often the theories and ideas that uphold it are just assumed to be just like the way things are, almost like the analogy of physics, like, oh, these are the laws of physics, this is the way things are.
So in this case, it's not you wouldn't even, it's not even presented as if there's pros and cons, but it either is this is how it is, or if you mess with it too much, then you only introduce cons and there's really no pros to introducing these inefficiencies. I think in economics, the con side we would talk about as like dead weight loss. And so it's almost like we're just being wasteful, I think is kind of how I was taught in high school that in this economic framework.
Yeah. So, that was in my early 20s. I went from just not having a lot of thoughts about capitalism other than an intuition that it's good because my upbringing seemed good. And it felt like, well, this must be how it is for people. And, if it is unfair for some people, you just need to, build your character and virtue. I know it all sounds like really,
Hmm.
obviously very privileged. I was just in a bubble. And then it went on to more of philosophically very pro cap. So from just intuitively capitalism is good to saying not just capital. Here's where we have to be careful with language. I've mentioned how there wasn't a name for this philosophy.
Hmm.
If people want to look more into it, they can look up the Austrian School of Economics, Austria, the country, the Chicago School of Economics. You'll hear names like Friedman and Hayek. Um, but yeah, there's not a lot of terms. So when we say questioning capitalism, we have to go back to what do we even mean by capitalism?
Hmm.
And this all kind of works together to make it hard to think deeply about this. There's a lot of just black and white thinking. Would you want to go into, I know this
Yeah,
is kind of
let's.
getting into why I started thinking more deeply about it, but I feel like even just the term thinking through what does capitalism mean is important to being able to question capitalism.
Yeah, I feel like capitalism. Um, when people talk about capitalism, it always means different things to different people, and so I
Mm-hmm.
think we want a working definition for what we are talking about here. And so, um, how would you define capitalism? Or if there's not really a good, like, one definition, what definition would you want to work through when we talk about it today?
Yeah, and see, this is such an important starting point for any kind of discussion. We see so much debate in the world, and so often there's just terms not being agreed on, and it's leading to all this back and forth. And so, yeah, a few things to point out first is, I don't have a degree in economics. This is all just stuff out of interest, and I think anyone, um, these things matter to us, and for most people, going to school for these things isn't an option. And so, I just hope, in this conversation, to just be able to think more openly about these things and to feel the freedom of being creative in thinking of these things and not just assuming the way things are the only way things can be or should be. And so with that, let's say capitalism growing up, I kind of just had a black and white. There's capitalism, and then I guess anything that's not capitalism maybe is communism. And to me, capitalism was, oh, well, you have private property and you have money and you buy and sell things. That's capitalism. And then communism is, I guess, you have a powerful government that decides what gets made and where it goes to. And in my head, it was very simple. Well, that was tried in Soviet Union, in China, various places, and it was disastrous. It requires such heavy-handed totalitarianism, and uh, it's not efficient. You end up with famines, and there's all this stuff that happened historically. So to me, it was just like, oh, case closed. Capitalism is better. And with that also came the thought of, well, capitalism always existed. When I had such a simplistic view of
Reversals.
capitalism, it was like, oh, well, if it's just about you have property and people can buy and sell things, and there's a profit motive, well, that just seems like it's as old as humanity, bartering, buying, selling. But that again, this is the language issue. Well,
Hmm.
what what specific form does buying and selling take in any given time? Maybe it's a little more conceptual to think this way, but we need to think about specific times and places, how goods are distributed, and not just think that there's just two umbrella categories. Because historically, you can go through, there's all these systems. You may have heard of feudalism, which is different than capitalism. Yes, there's still a market, but the way the market functions in society, that's really what we want to maybe talk about um, when we get into the pros and cons, is how does the market interact with society and the ideals of what a society should be and the ideals of what human life should be for individuals in that society. And so capitalism specifically is the market and the profit incentive taking a more central role in societies. So in almost any system, you're going to have a market. Just stuff has to be made. People want that. They're going to try and acquire that with currency, if there's a currency.
Hmm.
That's just going to be happening. The question is the market just one kind of machine within society, or is the market actually how society as a whole determines what should be made and where it should go? And so when we get to the 1700s, um, a famous thinker is Adam Smith, and he's looking at how, you know, the power of individual producers of things to react to the market. And by the market, we mean kind of looking at, well, how much does stuff sell for? And how much does it cost me to make it? And he's looking at how when people, if they just pursue what's going to make them the most profit, and at this time, we shouldn't be thinking of like mega, millionaires and stuff. He's looking at like blacksmiths and butchers and stuff who are just like kind of almost at a subsistence level of life. And it's like, well, how can I make a little more money for my family to be better off? And he said, look, when you pursue that, you say, oh, I could actually make horseshoes. No one in town's making horseshoes. So we're paying all this money to get horseshoes from another town. I can probably make them. No, I can. I can get the material for them, and I will make more money for myself. Horseshoes will cost less in the town, right? You can kind of imagine this kind of scenario, how it plays out. And this idea then is like, well, where profit accumulates, that's going to determine who has more stuff. And as you have more stuff, you can make more of those decisions. And this starts to replace, an older feudalistic idea of like the hierarchies within society, that you have just your kind of peasants, then you have your nobility, who just on the basis of being born into nobility have that status and decision-making power. Well, with capitalism, as opposed to like feudalism, it's, well, whoever starts accumulating the most stuff, which is called capital, like the stuff that you use to make more stuff, well, they have more power. It doesn't matter who, like what your last name is, in theory, in this system. And that was a very powerful mechanism. Just like this idea of profit, you can accumulate more stuff, and when you have more stuff, you can be more efficient at making even more stuff. This is like the engine of capitalism, and it starts to overthrow the older social order. And it's this social order we're talking about capitalism, not just that markets exist, but that the pursuit of profit really determines who has the power, and that this is actually for the better of everyone is the kind of philosophical point that is maybe worth debating.
Yeah.
That is it always better for everyone
So it sounds like for this discussion, we're gonna be talking about capitalism and focusing on the ideological side. Is that correct?
We will look at the ideological side maybe as it applies to the world right now.
Okay.
So maybe to clarify this a little bit, you have industrialism. I'm not going to go into depth in these terms. You can always start with Wikipedia and find sources from there, of course. But you have industrial revolution, where you have technology being innovated, which allows for a huge increase in the production of goods. This is even a good place to start about the pros of capitalism, because as we talk about the pros and cons of capitalism, it's going to depend on like what decade we are in. There's because so many things can be considered capitalism. There's no real ability to discuss or think critically if we're just saying, oh, the whole idea of profit motive. What we really want to look at is specific forms that this takes, because if we say we want to maybe make the world better, it doesn't mean we have to have an alternative form to capitalism. It just means, as capitalism currently is, what can we question and critique about it to imagine something better? And it's also still on the table. I'm not taking off the table maybe a completely different system, but the whole point here is just to think openly and creatively and not be boxed in by saying, well, this is the way things are. And so through industrialism, we get all these technological improvements. And here's a huge pro of capitalism. Philosophers had recognized that as population grows, the ability to provide goods for that population will never be able to keep up. And you'll hear something like the Malthusian trap, named after Malthus. I don't remember his first name. Malthus. Malthusian trap is, as population grows, the amount of stuff you produce can never really keep up. So all of humanity will be stuck right near subsistence level. And famines will cause the population to basically die until the point where everyone is barely surviving. And then maybe because of social hierarchies, you might have some nobility who live just through sheer power and influence above that level. But all of a sudden with technological innovation, the amount of stuff that can be produced scales more than even the growth of population. And so this is why when you look at kind of how humans live, you can almost imagine for
Mhm.
thousands, 10,000 years ago, people might have had carts and
Yeah,
livestock moving stuff. And 200 years ago, you can still imagine that. But in
yeah.
the last 200 years, trains, cars, the way humans live has changed drastically
Mhm.
in because of capitalism.
Yeah, so I think here, um, what happened, you talked about industrial revolution and kind of encourage people to look into it, but uh, I think what happened is that with this Malthusian trap, there was basically a bottleneck, and that bottleneck was somewhat labor and energy. And through the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of the steam engine, we could convert chemical energy
Mm.
into into work and in this case labor to produce food and goods. Is that right?
Yeah, that's interesting to get all the way down to like the metabolic level, right? It's like literally down to the chemistry of energy that a human can put out compared to. Um, yeah, I think that that's what's happening, and that just works with the profit motive because this machinery costs money, and it's hard for just not any individual can just have the resources to just buy a machine like that, right? So the
Mhm.
wealthier you are, it scales. The more wealth you have, the more you can produce more wealth, which then allows more stuff to be made. Um, and I guess looking at this early stage of capitalism actually brings out the pros and cons really sharply, um, and especially the cons. I think with in our lifetime, it can feel a little fuzzier. What are the cons of capitalism? Because we don't see things like children losing their arms in a cotton mill or the average life expectancy being like less
And
than 30 years for grown men in coal mining towns.
mhm.
Um, so though we see like cons in the 1800s that really stand out, which helps to maybe that helps to build sympathy for someone like Karl Marx, who is a name that can be like just very like, oh, we aren't going to go there. Obviously, we saw what happened with Russia and all that stuff. But it's like, if we actually look at how bad things were, I think maybe we can think
Mhm.
more sympathetically for why there's a desire to think of a radically different way of doing the economy. But in any case, an alternative doesn't really come up from the 1800s. We do see reforms. We see things like standard work weeks. We see all these um, innovations which help to increase the quality of life. But what's interesting is these regulations aren't just pure free market capitalism, right? There's an
Mhm.
intuition that you actually have to intervene in some way for the system to not just be extremely exploitative. And then the argument can be made, well, it's still extremely exploitative. But even if we just compare that, right? Like the idea of 12-hour work weeks, 6 days a week, um, family life is disintegrated among the poor who don't really have options. It's like do this or starve. You could say, oh, why, what is you just move out and become a hunter, gatherer, forager? Well, that's just like not even a skill set, someone's raised. It's just not even in the
Mhm.
social imagination like that there are,
Mhm.
are alternatives, right? You're like in the system, you were born in the city, you're raised in the city, you're probably going to die in the city. You don't have options. The people owning the factories kind of set
Yeah.
the terms of what life will be
And
like.
in some sense, was there kind of primary option to go on strike? Was that a thing that was happening, or do you think people were so poor that that was not even an option?
Yeah, I don't think that that's really an option. The idea of unions comes out of just necessity of survival because the thing is you have to band together to strike. Like and the problem is that, people have different temperaments and we know some people have a can for whatever reason some people can resign themselves more to we can put it in negative or positive terms. Some people can endure or cope with difficult situations more strongly, or we might put it more negatively, people can
Mhm.
resign themselves to difficult situations. And so to get a whole group to say let's all stop working means not only the people who are most devastated, right? So it's easy for the people who are most devastated by the system to say let's just stop. But for people who, let's say, well, you know what, I am able to survive, I am bringing food to the table for my family, like as terrible as this is, I can't risk it. And with you, that's why you
Yeah.
need organization to get to the point to say, you know what, like this, we really all are living terribly. And even if someone has convinced themselves that it's actually okay, we really need to all stand together and do this. Um, and to see, this idea of system justification, um, where even the people most negatively impacted by the way things are can defend the way things are. And this is just part of how humans are. Frederick Douglass said how one of the most frustrating things about what he was doing was often trying to convince other slaves that having their wives taken from them and beat and their children killed, that there's better ways life could be than that. And that when you are in a system, it's very hard to imagine there's anything better. Right. And so I bring that up because that's one of the most clearly terrible living situations. And Frederick Douglass said, even in that situation, it was hard to convince other slaves that the situation was really bad.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of taking that argument to an extreme, but it's human nature.
No, I think the point that you're getting at is that we have to be able to, like, it's hard to even imagine a better system or that we could even get there. And you're using, I think, the like American slave trade system to kind of help bring us into a context where we go, okay, yeah, people in that day couldn't have fathomed escaping that and getting anywhere better, but through hope and individuals really advocating for change, we eventually moved on past that system. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think there's a few analogies. That's one of them. The one thing I really wanted to get at is the human tendency to downplay how bad things are, even though if someone's outside of the situation, they can look and go, oh no, that is terrible. That is so demeaning. That is so brutal. But for someone who's being crushed by the system, there's just a spread of human temperaments, right? And for some people, there's going to be this tendency to just say, you know what, this is just the way things are. Even though with like will and hope, it is possible for that to change. And I say that because if something as brutal as the system of slavery, it was hard for people in that system to imagine that there could be better ways of living, then it's just going to be even harder for us in a system that isn't as just like abjectly brutal, right? Like life and death brutal. It's going to be harder for us to imagine.
Got it. So a modern day equivalent would be like someone who's trapped in a life of sex trafficking or prostitution, and they just believe that that's what they were meant for. That's how life is, and there's nothing they can do about it. Is that a similar situation?
Yeah. And I know we're talking about mindsets of situations we hopefully would never be in, but I think that there's just a range of temperaments. Some people we just seem to see in history are more prone to revolution, more prone to escape. But for a large, if there's like a bell curve of human temperaments, for a lot of people, it's more, how do I psychologically just make do with the way things are? And it's understandable because like,
I see.
Not having hope makes it so that you can't be disappointed, right? So I'm not even trying to say, oh, that's like terrible that someone would self-justify. It's just like, when we look at problems in the world and what does it take to change the problem, it's human nature for us to just like resist change, even if that change would be for our benefit. And so if in an extreme example that's true, then in a less extreme example, but still pretty bad, would be the situation of laborers in factories and coal mines, and getting to people to say, let's all stop working at the same time, to get people to agree that it's in our interest to all stop until they're willing to pay us more, because they don't need that much money. They can definitely pay us more. There's no reason for them not to be, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because just the pure profit motive, those who own the stuff are going to say, we want to make as much more stuff as possible, so we want to pay people as little as possible. And even if it's just right on the edge of like living life and death for them. Without kind of an aside going through union, we were talking about when is it better to strike? So
it took us on a tangent. I think you were talking about how the pros during this early industrial revolution, the pros were being able to produce a lot more goods, less people starving, but there still was a lot of terrible conditions for workers. I think I guess a capitalist argument. Uh, well, historically we see that. I think a capitalist argument would be that, um, if for like that another firm would pay higher wages to recruit, I guess, more talented workers to their, let's say, factory. So why does that not happen in the sense that, okay, if you're really having terrible conditions over here, I think the philosophy, or the ideology kind of predicts that, okay, well, another place is going to pay you more because you're so unhappy here, and you'll just move over there. Well, why is that not happening?
I think it has to do with the scale. So if it's hard for 10,000 workers to work together for their best interest, it's not as hard for 15, 12 businessmen to say, hey, this is the wage we're able to pay the population of Birmingham. Let's just stick to this.
So you're implying some coordination, whether explicit or implicit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is the problem with monopolies. And according to capitalist theory, monopolies actually are a distortion of the market. So in a pure capitalistic thinking, this actually is itself a distortion of capitalism. Monopoly capitalism is not what a philosophically pro-capitalist person would actually want.
Because competition is gone at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. But so then this is a disconnect that a pro-capitalist view has to, this is why I said it's important to look at specific times in history, because the theory of capitalism, the elegant formulas of capitalism, if they don't actually connect to the real world, that's a problem. In fact, this is the number one thing people who say communism or socialism doesn't work. I remember growing up, I hear things like, oh, well, in theory it sounds nice, but in practice, because of human nature, it doesn't work out to just have everyone have the same stuff. Well, it was always a one-sided argument, because I would never hear that same logic applied to, oh, capitalism would work so great for humans if only humans were better creatures, right? Like, I never heard that argument. I would only hear that applied to communism or socialism. Yeah, giving everyone the same amount of stuff would be great, but human nature is people would get jealous and people would be lazy and you lose all these incentives. So
Yeah.
you have to stick with capitalism. And it's like, well, wait, we take all these mechanisms of capitalism about how there's always open information. Everyone does what's like best. And it's all of those assumptions. And that's, so, it's been 20 minutes since you asked why I started having questions. One of the first questions is even the assumption that humans are rational beings defined by rationality. There's so many definitions that get into this stuff. Defined by a certain way of thinking of rationality, which is just almost like a computer-like processing, which isn't how humans always thought of rationality. But anyways, in the last few hundred years, we think of rationality as like computer-like processing of information. So
are you saying that that in justifying capitalism, there were some faulty presuppositions? One of them is that people will act like rationally in their best self-interest to kind of maximize their maybe profits or something for themselves.
Yeah.
Especially in the long run. I think that's one faulty presupposition. What's another faulty presupposition? I think the one we started with was that monopolies would not dominate. Is that a presupposition of capitalism, or is that or competition would always exist? I guess that's the faulty presupposition. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess if we were to look, it would be that, well, if there's multiple, if someone has a monopoly, if someone has better, they would say, well, someone could make a factory that has better living standards and people would go to work there, but just the economy of scale, once that monopoly is established, you can try to be ethical and all these things, but there's things like predatory pricing, right? Like a monopoly can price below profit. Amazon, in our own day, Amazon was able to expand into domains that weren't its bread and butter, because they already had excess profit, so that they can go into another market
Yes.
below the actual market price.
Yeah.
They're just taking a loss in that market. So competitors who that market is their foundation can't compete anymore. And
Mm.
this is like the idea of predatory pricing, that once you're big enough, you can make up for losses in other markets with your profit from like the market you already are really dominant in.
Mm.
And so there are so many distortions to the ideal. And so this is where in the 20th century, after the Great Depression, we have the idea that, you know what, capitalism needs a lot more regulation. This is John Maynard Keynes, would be someone saying we need to be able to, the government can be this outside influence that can create jobs even when the market prices don't seem to be like wanting jobs, right? The market itself isn't asking for jobs, to kind of
Mm.
personify the market, but the government can keep creating jobs.
Filtering. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can um, have better regulations for. There's just all these ways that the government can intervene, and you end up with, to not make it sound too conspiratorial, but for businessmen who benefit from the site, like the way things are, they want to push back against that way of thinking.
Mm.
And there were problems. There are distortions to the model that happen, so to speak, that can be um, highlighted. And so there's a way of thinking that starts to lead into what I mentioned earlier about the Austrian or Chicago School of Economics, which there's variations but similar themes, that, you know what, we really need to get back to deregulating the markets. The main thing the government should be doing is breaking up monopolies. So it gets down to like, okay, the government has to do something, but the one thing the government should do is just remove distortions to the market. So we go from just let the market do whatever and have no regulation to like,
Mm.
okay, well, capitalism itself distorts itself. So we do need some sort of regulation, but all that regulation should do is like
Yeah.
remove irregularities, which means in effect, the way the government should work is mainly protecting businessmen so they can have more free competition. So it's like, look, if you make it so businessmen can compete more fairly, you reduce the chances of monopolies, and the common people will benefit as a result. So the emphasis is still on where the government power is used. It should be used on behalf of the market itself, not on
Mm.
behalf of individual people, but on
Mhm.
behalf of the market. And an early term that was used for this was neoliberalism, but that term only was used very early by proponents of this view. And now when you see neoliberalism, it's pretty much always a critique of this philosophy. And so that's why the word neoliberalism is controversial, because it's used by critics of this philosophy.
Mm.
But what's interesting is this philosophy doesn't have its own name, which is also why a pejorative term is what has stuck. And it's
Well,
important to,
so why is the term not neoliberalism then? I thought it kind of sounds like you're saying, well, this is what it's called, but what do you mean by it doesn't have a name if this is what it's called?
because people who actually hold this worldview would say that's just a pejorative term that's used for criticisms of the view.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and it's important to look at this worldview because this is what most of us have grown up in, is a worldview that would pejoratively be called neoliberalism. Um, it kind of presents itself as just the way things are. So that's why, this is why it might be a pejorative term, but it's like, in all fairness, if we're going to present it as a form of objective truth, then it makes it impossible to analyze. And so fine, if only your opponents are the ones willing to give it a name, then that's the name that's going to kind of stick. But this is going all the way back to, when did I first start questioning capitalism?
Mm.
Well, first I became more entrenched in it because of adopting what is pejoratively called neoliberalism. You know, the problem is government. The problem
Yeah.
is regulations that distort the market. The problem is when the government is providing public goods, because if the government's providing it, the market can't balance out the incentives to provide it for the best price to the most people. And I read a book on this. Maybe I can find what it was and put it in the note, in notes or
Sure.
something. Except that now I would not recommend reading this book because I've just realized how it presented itself is very rigorous. But now that I've looked back at it, it's all at the level of abstract ideas. And when it would provide proof cases of like, here are countries where this philosophy of like deregulation, ending unions, all this kind of stuff is for the best of everyone. Its top examples were Turkey and Brazil. And this book was written in like 2008. But if you follow through what happened, Brazil is not held up as a model country of justice and, you know, abundance. Turkey too, like these countries. So, and this gets at the pros and cons of capitalism. When a nation first deregulates their economy, you're going to see often an increase in jobs. You're going to see an increase in goods. You're going to see a decrease in prices. So that first introduction of like deregulating has an allure. But the problem is that the people who own the factories, who own the production, are the ones accumulating that wealth. And then they're the ones deciding how the economy keeps growing. And you end up always, I shouldn't say always, but it seems like almost axiomatic that when you deregulate, you increase inequality. And one of the problems is we have a philosophy that we're operating in when we say humans will do what's best for them. And it's this view almost that humans are all completely individual and what's best for them can be determined by them. But I think philosophically and sociologically and psychologically, humans are part of communities, and meaning and purpose comes from those communities. And so if capitalism as a pro increases the amount of goods there are, it also increases competition and division in societies. And so even if you could say, okay, we have all this inequality, yeah, but this bottom level, look, they have like smartphones now. Like even some of the poorest people in certain societies, like they just have access to stuff. Look, they have plumbing. Like the poorest people 200 years ago did not have plumbing. Like there's stuff that everyone has, but that acts as if the way we relate to our society doesn't matter. That all that matters is the material goods we have. And again, if we start to look across other fields of studying human nature, we have to live with humans as we are. You can have all these models of how humans should be or could be, what could make humans happy if we had different brains than we have, but all of that is counterfactual. No, we have, we are what we are.
Yeah.
And
I kind of wanted to kind of maybe poke at this a little bit because it sounds like one of your arguments, or maybe not arguments, but your position is that an individual person doesn't necessarily know at a conscious level what's best for them, and could be right. It could be or that maybe they need to be part of something bigger than themselves to actually be thriving. But given that, it kind of feels like this might start be getting into like more subjective analysis of what it means to have higher quality of life. And if the individual doesn't get to decide for themselves what that is, doesn't that necessarily mean that a power higher than them would have to decide for them? And if it's not a business, then it'll be a government, or it'll be a leader or something like that.
Okay. So what I'm getting at is that it's not even necessarily about subjective experience. It's really more getting into anthropology, sociology, psychology, that there are things that even if someone wants them, they don't have the power to make that happen. If a town says, you know what, it would be so awesome to still have like a barbershop where everyone goes and talks on a Saturday morning, and a bowling alley with a league, and no individual gets to choose what their town is like. Even if that's something they wanted, even like with their choices, I can get a Spotify and a Netflix subscription. I can do this and that, but I can't actually, no matter how much I want it, change the society I'm in.
Mhm.
And so if capitalism is producing societies that people are start to just say, I would rather my town or where I live or the community I be in
Mm,
be different, I don't have the individual choice of that.
I see.
That's
Yes.
outside of my buying and selling power.
Okay. So,
And so it's more getting at, if capitalism makes society, like changes the way society is, even if an individual says, I would live in a different, I would prefer that there was still more like local communal stuff going on. Like, okay, I
mm,
can go on Reddit, I have some sort of community there, YouTube comments, but
see.
that feeling of, like it seems like humans in past generations had a had these, you know, a sense of community and sense of connectedness that the current way technology and capitalism interact has kind of replaced,
Mm,
is more what I'm
yeah.
getting at, rather
Okay.
than saying someone doesn't know what they want, which is its
Okay.
own point. That actually can be teased out a little more, that people aren't good at deciding what's best for them. But even apart from that, I'm saying that the options presented by capitalism tend to
Hmm.
be assume that individuals can just make individual decisions apart from anyone around them. Where it's like, well, what if part of what I want is a certain community around me?
Got it.
And that's
Okay.
not able to be
Yeah,
bought.
I see. And I guess, um, if I'm understanding correctly, the reason why a lot of these uh, meaningful interactions and integrations with the community are starting to disappear more is that in the capitalist framework as we've defined it, it's hard to account for the demand for these things in a quantifiable way, because in a capitalist framework, that's only in the model in the form of price, in the sense of like, can I buy it? Am I paying
Yeah.
for that? And
Yeah.
and what gets put into this function is, okay, is this producing more capital? And some of these things that you're talking about, like community centers and playgrounds and stuff like that, is not it's not really accurately represented in these models. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah. I think that's exactly a part of the problem. So in this view that the market is ultimate like the ultimate decision maker. So that if we wanted to get down to like what is neoliberalism, it's like the market itself is just so beyond any one person's foresight, because it takes on everyone's like behaviors and it just
Mm,
gives us the optimal solution. This is like one of the presuppositions of this kind of the economy as the ultimate decider for societies. Um,
mm,
so basically, it's like we shouldn't rely on philosophy or ethics to make decisions, because philosophy and ethics, they believe, are already accounted for in the behaviors in the profit motive. So it's just saying the profit motive takes account everything,
yeah.
takes everything else into account. So all you need to look at is the profit motive. But I think that even without doing deep scholarly like analysis of that claim, it feels like more and more people are saying just intuitively, like, no, that doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Because,
I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
well, from my point of view, it feels like it should be accounted in the market. Like, yeah, like if I want local barber shop where I can have friends, and I want places to play board games with my neighbors, it feels like that should emerge in the market just through supply and demand. But I feel like intuitively people are starting to feel like this is not happening. It's not true. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it seems to be experientially true.
Yeah, so let's go into the example of a public park. In order for just the fact that it's a public park means that it's already not being accounted for, right? Because if we want to talk about profit motive, they need to be private parks. And as soon as we're talking about private parks, we're again talking about things that is like a subscription model. Whereas I think for a lot of people, it's just like we recognize it's a nice thing to have a park you go to for
Yeah,
free or a beach you go to. Anyone in town can go to it, whether they're
yeah,
wealthy or poor. It's something we have in common. And if it's has to be only taken into account through the profit model, you don't have public spaces like that. You have private spaces.
hmm hmm
And for the extreme economic view, it would be, well, that's fine. That gives an incentive of someone to get a better job so that they can afford more of these perks. But there's a point where it's like everything turning into this competition of I only get stuff by other people not getting stuff. There comes a point where I think ethics and philosophy start to call out in the street again, so to speak. You know, the whole history of the human pursuit of what is a good human life. And you can't just sideline all of that to say the profit motive takes care of everything. And even if this feels hand wavy and just like, oh, it's just subjective, um, there's a reason why so an interesting maybe data point is to look at in 2016, two of the most popular candidates were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And they seem as like opposite as can be almost, right? One person is very much about labor, one person's very much about big businesses, but they were the only two candidates saying the system is rigged. You could hear Bernie Sanders say the system is rigged, and you could hear Donald Trump say the system is rigged. And there is an appeal to that because I think people are tired of hearing that, well, things are things are good. We just need to like fix a little bit. And you could hear both Republicans and Democrats say, "Oh, we just need to make these little changes." But there is a sense across, political ideologies of just like life is a grind. Like people who were alive in previous generations, like middle-aged people, are like something is different about life. People who their whole life have been conservative, pro-capitalist, are like things just aren't the way they should be. And
yeah,
now we can come up with different reasons for this. And this is where you'll have some people, they want to have a scapegoat. Why are things not like when I was growing up? Well, capitalism is good, so it can't break. Some people just straight ahead will say there's
yeah,
nothing about the economy that needs to change. It's fill in the blank scapegoat people group. Or you end up with more progressive people saying, well, it is the economy, it needs to be this or that. And regardless of what someone says the solution is, there is a growing sense that the way society is organized is not working out well for people, even who are in the same social class as they were 30 years ago, or in the same kind of place in society, feel more like there's an emptiness. And this is what's worth pursuing. So even if we don't have academic formulations or like answers of like, well, it's subjective. When a lot of people are feeling something, it's worth then investigating. And that's the thing that I hope the curiosity to say the way capitalism currently is, which is that we have big companies kind of deciding what's best for humanity, especially tech companies. Once capitalism and tech, Silicon Valley kind of are the new kind of tight bond where before you might have factories and
yeah.
capitalism, now we have tech companies.
Well, I don't want to say that that's not true, but I think from a defender of capitalism would say it's not the big tech company deciding, it's the market deciding. How would you resolve that tension?
So the bottleneck of every decision is the CEOs making the decisions. And so even if we can imagine that the market could come up with an ultimate solution, we have humans acting on these. And part of handful of tech companies that have just like unilateral power you don't even have that competition, because in theory, the competition is where that information gets worked out. So imagine you have like 50 versions of every major tech platform, and you have variations where some have better just functionality, or the way they impact society people are more in alignment with. Then sure, you could say the competition gets whittled down. But the
Yeah.
reality is that a few companies corner the market, and you run into this problem that is like has come up with things like energy, like power grids, where things actually are way more efficient when only a few companies have that power. So, for example, an example is electricity and gas. Imagine if you had multiple power plants and gas companies trying to compete. Like, it just wouldn't work. The way power grids scale is that's just way less efficient. And so also something like having some form of social network, if your friends are spread across 30 different social networks, the appeal of having a social network, it
Yeah,
loses appeal.
I
And so
see.
that's part of this contradiction,
Yeah,
is that, yeah,
maybe we could break this down into, because I feel like here's an opportunity to kind of um, highlight a pro and con. It seems like what you're saying is that for certain markets, such as like utilities, such as social media, by having the power concentrated, it makes these services very efficient. Maybe it reduces some of the costs and overhead, but in this modern era where there's these big corporations have so much power that the ideals of capitalism are breaking down because this competition is not even there. So for instance, when Instagram was becoming a competitor to Facebook, Facebook could just buy Instagram. And now they have all the social media platform, or a lot of social media platforms. You see this with Match Group, who owns most of the dating apps out there. Is when a new one's coming out, they can just buy that. And so I guess kind of what we were trying to say was that, okay, maybe in theory, um, the market could the market might be trying to tell, or sorry, the information that's crying out saying, hey, we want something different, we want something better, is actually getting hidden because I guess this we started with big tech, but it could apply to any industry. They're able to essentially buy that and suppress it in a way with all that power that maybe was unprecedented in previous generations, or maybe it was always there, but it's getting even worse in terms of scale. Is that right?
yeah. And again, this goes to why when I say we we want to question capitalism, we mean in our specific moments, because it may turn out that still a form of having an economy that generally runs by the profit motive and all this stuff may turn out to still be the best, right? I'm so what I don't want is if someone says, "Oh, question capitalism." Okay, this is just extremist stuff, right? It should be just normal, like, are things the best they could be? Do I have reason to think that people might be making decisions that are beneficial to themselves and harmful to other people? It's like really simple stuff. And if so, is there a way for government, or, and this is what gets difficult, is why it's hard to talk about capitalism without talking about philosophy, government, sociology, because capitalism is acting as a replacement for all these things in its purest form. But we don't need people enforcing their ethical values. The market will encapsulate all of that. And so until we're able to question that presumption, that it doesn't seem like there's other options.
Question the presumption that
That the that governments are the problem. So for a lot of people, because of the history of government corruption and government waste, the idea that governments should somehow limit markets, right? So anything that's not capitalism. So if capitalism is kind of the free expression of the market, then any system that's not capitalism is going to say there needs to be boundaries to the market. Okay, I finally have kind of put together what I'm trying to say. We talked about earlier, there's always markets in human history. Before capitalism exists as markets. Capitalism says, you know what? The market shouldn't just be part of society that produces goods. The market actually should be how all of our decisions get made. It should be how, in an extreme form, it's how we should think of public or education. It's like, which is kind of happening. Universities compete for grants, and it's like market competition. It's the idea that just let the market run free because it's going to make the most efficient decisions, right? And so a system that's not capitalism in that most open form is going to say, we need to put boundaries on the market. Well, in order to put boundaries on the market, you have to have enforcement more powerful than the people who own the means of production. You have to have, and that's like what governments act for. Even in the neoliberal view, governments have to have enough power to break down monopolies or enough power to keep the market undisturbed. But what's interesting is that, and this is why there's a lot of criticism of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism will not present itself as saying the government. Well, this might be where you start to get a difference between neoliberalism and what becomes known as neoconservatism. There's ways that they're related, but neoconservatism does take some ethics into account, or its own sense of worldview. It's very much for free markets, but still with certain other social values tied in. So, for example, where a complete free market would say there should be no regulations on any type of human behavior, neoconservatism is going to say there should be free markets, but there obviously are some types of behavior that we need to restrict. Neoconservatism, the reason I bring it up is because in the 90s and 2000s, it's really influential. We have George Bush and a lot of people who work with him operating in this worldview. I mentioned neoliberalism because pretty much everyone from Ronald Reagan up through Obama are working within neoliberalism. Even Democrats. This is why it's important to like be able to think through these things. Before Ronald Reagan, a Democrat like John F. Kennedy might still talk about providing public goods, like the government taking care of people.
Yeah.
With Bill Clinton, it's how do we tweak the economy so that it provides its goods for everyone? So the neoliberalism takes over to the point where the answer always is through the economy, through the market. Whereas before that, there's a sense of there are some things that just by principle are so important, it's not up for the economy to decide. Whereas Bill Clinton, it's going to be more, how do we make the market more fair to everyone, rather than how do we take care of this without the market? And it's become just the common sense. And that's why it's important to think, well, what are the alternatives from the past? Even a Republican like Eisenhower would take views that now even a Democrat often would not be able to take. Other than that, there is now, of course, a very progressive wing within the Democratic Party, but it's by no means the mainstream. The Bernie Sanders, AOC, people like that.
So maybe I could use a concrete example to kind of try to understand this better. So one of these things that is commonly cited as being non-negotiable is universal health care.
Yeah.
And Obama he promised universal health care, but that ended up taking the form of Obamacare, which was health care provided through insurance companies that were private insurance companies. Would an alternative have been like, I guess, government? Like, would an alternative idea to this, for this idea of universal healthcare, be something like government providing healthcare directly to the citizens? Would that be like an alternative?
Yeah, and a lot of first world countries have that. Canada, There's Australia too. I'd have to look into the details of that. A lot of first world countries who are, and this is again, when we say question capitalism, we mean question the economy as it functions at specific times and places. Because the answer to the form of capitalism that we might have a problem with might be another form of capitalism. Maybe not, but also maybe so. The point
Mm.
is to have freedom to think creatively. That's what I want to keep coming back to. Because
Mm.
this isn't about becoming like radical or socialist, but it's also about not having anything off the table. It's just
Mm.
like whether it's a little bit of reform or imagining a whole new system that takes generations of people kind of making normalizing it in conversation, normalizing it in policies that get written. It's saying we can imagine with the abundance we have because of capitalism. So we say, okay, the pro of capitalism, there's so much abundance. And we can say, well, what do you want to go back to? Sometimes when we say, if you say, well, I want something different than capitalism, someone could say, well, look at all the other forms of economy in the past. This is better
Mm.
than all of them. But that's not the question. The question is, given what we have now, are there ways we could go that are even better? Even if capitalism has raised, like, lowered abject suffer, decreased the amount of abject suffering in the world, given where we are now and given the current distribution of wealth,
Mm.
are there ways to do even better?
Yeah.
To and that's where it's like being open to thinking differently and being willing to criticize aspects of capitalism without it feeling like the foundations of reality are shaking or
Mm.
without taking it personally. When I would hear someone criticize something of capitalism, it felt like something deep in my identity was being shaken. And I think that's what I would hope if there are people in that place to just be able to talk freely about the relation of the economy to society as a whole and to be willing to question the profit motive. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Maybe what we could do with the last 10 minutes is just, have a summary of, and maybe we haven't even discussed some of these, but a summary of what you think the pros of capitalism are, maybe kind of in a bulleted list, uh, with a little bit of explanation, and then the cons of capitalism, from your opinion, in a bit of a bulleted list.
Yeah. So the pros, I mean, going all the way back to the start, when we think about just the very fundamental life and death reality of human life, capitalism has allowed the production in tandem with technology, which capitalism and technology go well together because technology helps produce more stuff and capitalism, right? We talked about that cycle. Um, there's just more goods. There's more food. We've never had more availability of things like food and building materials and um, materials for housing, materials for plumbing,
Mm.
all these kinds of things that just raise the quality of life. Capitalism allows for all of that. Capitalism um, can break down really unjust social structures that exist for centuries or millennia, where you have families that have power and there's nothing that can move them from that power because power is based on status.
Mm.
But now the power of money starts to be able to challenge that. And so you have more social mobility because if
Mm.
someone is able to start making more money, they can establish themselves. And this is where, if you study the history of capitalism, which I'm not an expert in, I've never taken the course in directly, but just kind of learning a little bit of just general history, is that you start to have the rise of the merchant class, which starts to be able to challenge the established nobility.
Mm.
And you start to have a middle class, right? So this idea of, for a large, before you have a very, we talk about inequality, you have just like peasants and nobility. Well, with capitalism, you end up now having a middle class where people aren't just living to survive. They also aren't getting to make all the decisions to run the world, so to speak, right? They aren't like the nobility, but they're able to live a life where they have comforts, they have leisure, things like that. Um, Those are some of the pros.
Yeah,
We get such a variety of conveniences. It really, a lot of it comes down to conveniences and comforts. There's so
yeah.
many conveniences and comforts that become available.
Maybe variety too, right? Like
Yeah,
because
variety.
there's a demand for a lot of different types of products, whether physical or maybe even
Yeah,
intellectual. And so we see like um, 10,000 shows on Netflix, right?
yeah.
10,000 shows on Disney Plus. They're pumping out new ones every week.
Yeah, it can almost feel embarrassing to list the pros of capitalism because it does almost start to philosophically raise the question, is this actually all there is, though? Right? But I'll still list them as goods, but it can almost start to feel like, oh, am I being materialistic? Like, yeah, I get more flavors of like ice cream and I get more options of, but those are pros. These
Hmm.
are all pros. But I think even
Yeah.
as you list them, it can start to raise the question in light
Okay.
of all the social turmoil we see in the world,
Yeah.
like racially, gender, but all these things. Regardless of where you land on these debates, we can see these things pulling apart. And it's like, is having perfectly catered music playlists and having a freezer full of my favorite ice creams, like, is there a point where a system that can produce all of this, maybe it's better if we think of ways that um,
So
we
for
take
instance,
this bigger picture. Yeah.
okay, so we can have
Start
a
to
more
consider the
equal.
bigger
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Bigger
yeah,
picture.
consider how the economy affects the bigger picture rather than just how it affects our individual buying options.
Mm, okay.
Um, Especially once we get past that threshold of like how the pro of capitalism helping to alleviate poverty and starvation and all this stuff. Once we
Mm,
get into that middle class like area of like middle class possibilities, that's where I say, well, maybe there's other branches capitalism can take.
mm,
Instead of writing the mechanism that ends poverty all the way through to its most absurd extremes of
hmm.
like ending, like, what
Yeah.
if there's different routes where we take what's good of capitalism
Yeah.
and take that, what is created through the profit motive, but then get back to having healthy debate and discussion
Mm,
of like what is good for society and where do we put boundaries on the
hmm.
market. And so
Yeah.
this is just the natural lead. Are there any other pros you want to mention?
I don't. I have to think about it a little bit more, but I think just to summarize what you were just saying, you're saying that capitalism was good for getting us out of poverty, but it hit a point of diminishing returns, and as creative people, we should think about possibly pivoting strategies, uh, to have a more balanced. Um, sorry, that because there's diminishing returns, we should probably think about maybe changing our strategies and uh, going forward and questioning whether or not there's maybe perhaps better strategies for what we really want going forward. Is that right?
Yeah, because the pros of capitalism, it starts getting more and more into, I get ads targeted to me that help me find stuff that I want. Like, it starts to almost feel petty what
Mm,
the benefits are of continuing this, like
okay.
where the profit motive leads us. It's just all about those who have the means, those who aren't working still at near poverty levels, and even people who are in certain areas in America are going to have access to YouTube, right? It's like, oh, look, you have access to all sorts of entertainment or education, or like we're just presented with so many options, and that's the pro.
Hmm.
And it just comes, and that, but that's why I'm saying, is that pro? Would we be willing to give up the amount of variety if we can imagine that there's a way where society itself could feel healthier?
Mm,
And without even saying there is a direct answer to that, it's just being open to question that and think about it. Because
hmm.
for a lot of people, I think there's even just like a ceiling they run into to even imagine other possibilities. Because there's this feeling that if someone's against capitalism as it exists, it must mean this extremist like kind of thing, rather
Mm,
than just being open minded.
yeah. Here's maybe another pro I thought about is I feel like capitalism does get us to be more competitive, and there's a con in that, but there's maybe a pro in the sense that um, it might drive us to kind of reach our potential more. Is that
Yeah. Oh yeah.
possible?
So
Yeah.
yeah, let's go into those too. Yeah. Pros. Yeah, it does motivate us. Again, there's like different human temperaments. Some people are very self-driven, but for other people, we tend to make decisions that aren't great for ourselves, and we almost need that negative, that prod to do
Mm-hmm.
something. And so the the kind of inherent danger of having enough can motivate us to live lives that actually end up being, yeah, lead us more to our potential. There was another one too. Oh, it still has the power to destroy, um, like to overthrow. Social mobility is still, in theory, an aspect of capitalism. Um,
Mm.
that people can't stay in power just because of their family name, but someone else with a great idea or someone else who works really hard can, um, rise above their family's past, kind of thing. Where if you're in a system where society is, where the market doesn't get to make those decisions, where instead just the families with power get to keep making those decisions, right? So that's the thing. Capitalism has a very destructive power, and we can think of it positive destruction, like destruction that seems good, which is breaking down, like oppressive family, like status structures or things like that. But it also is very destructive in ways that it destroys things that we might value. And so that's the question. Capitalism has immense
Mm.
power to overthrow the way things are.
Mm.
And the question is, what things are we willing to let the market overthrow?
Okay. Maybe moving on to the cons then. I think you were kind of maybe framing that as kind of almost neutral because it has the power to destroy bad things and it has power to destroy good things. Moving over to cons, what do you think are some of those good things that it tends to destroy?
By incentivizing humans to see themselves as individual competitors, it tends to alienate us from other humans. And
Mm-hmm.
while I think there's growing concern that, oh, is using tech platforms making us feel more lonely, I think it's worth investigating how the interaction of technology and capitalism together, work. And this is where, again, we have to think outside of just economics, which starts to feel more subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But the way we are incentivized to live, to maximize our potential,
Mm-hmm.
leads us to be more disconnected from other people.
Yeah, we see that in like schools in upper class areas like in Palo Alto, hyper competitive high school environments, um, where people feel like if they want to get into Stanford or Harvard, they can't help their classmates, who are, right next to them in the hierarchy.
Yeah. And so this is something that, go back to, again, super controversial name, Karl Marx. He was saying way back in the mid 1800s that capitalism would lead to people being more lonely.
Mm-hmm.
He was just saying, like, this is just obviously, to him, it was just a plain obvious thing. Capitalism is going to lead to people just seeing everyone as a competitor. It's going to tear apart families, tear apart even, and this is where we talk about it can overthrow things that are positive and negative. The Karl Marx didn't like organized religion. He saw it as overthrowing organized religion, but he pointed out to supporters of capitalism that it's ironic because he's like, look, this is going to overthrow organized religion as a unifying system in society, and you say you want that. And so he kind of ironically pointed out
Mm.
that it overthrows things good and bad, but to him, largely, it overthrows so much that unless it changes, well, actually, Karl Marx wasn't saying things should change. He was saying it overthrows so much that humans will eventually change the system. That's the thing that, Karl Marx wasn't so much saying, um, capitalism is bad and so we have to fix it. He was saying capitalism overthrows the problems of the past and it has within itself the power to overthrow itself, because a new humans, in just pursuing what is best for themselves, will find that the isolation of capitalism,
He was saying it was self-defeating, is what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah. Now he did. Yeah, I don't want to get as much into that because, again, I'm not a Marx scholar. There's lots of debates on interpreting Marx and what he was trying to do with intellectually. Because on the other hand, he is famous for a quote is like, the thing isn't to identify the problems in the world. The thing is to actually change the world. And so then that is a little different than saying he's just making observations, if he is saying the goal is to actually change things. But somewhere in that tension where he's on the one hand just making observations descriptively, and then also on the other hand he does have kind of activist mindset of how do we change things, even though history is going to play itself out in his mind according to these dynamics. There still is a place to be activist, and I don't know the details of how those two things play out, the inevitability versus the call to activism.
So maybe related to this topic, one of the cons could be eventual violence. Is that right? Or do you think that emerges in any structure?
Yeah.
Or maybe we could start, before getting to that point, we could just talk about inequality.
Yeah. So one of the main cons of capitalism is that even though, so pre-capitalism, you do have this huge divide between royalty and nobility and then like the common people. So on the one hand, capitalism can maybe start to bridge that gap, but then it introduces another one, which is that once you have people who own the factories, who own the way things get made, profit keeps accumulating to them, and they're the ones getting to make the decisions. And so they're going to keep making decisions that keep getting them more stuff. And they're going to be they're going to be in the form of wages. They're going to be giving away enough to keep people working for them, but not, what's going to be best for everyone? Like, what's going to be best for the families that work for me? It's really, what can I pay to stay competitive and to keep getting as much profit for myself as I can. And so the con is that when you increase inequality, and inequality is just not healthy for us. We talk about humans have a social need. We can try to talk abstractly. There's a desire to sound objective. We already talked about this, like, oh, things like life satisfaction, well, that sounds kind of subjective. But it's just a reality that humans aren't machines where it's just about consuming what makes us feel good. Like, there's an assumption about capitalism being good for everyone that's something like, we're just processing, we're rational things that just make decisions that are best for us, and just being able to buy stuff is what is fulfilling for a human. And it's like, well, let's back up. There's things that it's not just about consuming. Like, there is a level, what's do you know what the hierarchy of needs, whose thing is that?
Maslow.
Yeah.
It's kind of old. It's kind of old and outdated, but
it's old, and I know it's not valid anymore. But when we think about that,
it's
some of those stages, we think of like levels of where just pure consumption does increase well-being. Like, at a literal sense, we have to consume food.
Yeah.
Right. That's just a literal sense of where consumption is for our benefit. But there gets to be a point where, aren't there studies that show self-reported life satisfaction? There's a certain income above which actual life satisfaction or contentment doesn't scale with income anymore.
It plateaus basically. Yeah,
it plateaus. And so it doesn't, one of the cons of capitalism is that it assumes that just increasing consumption and buying power and more consumption is what is like best for people, and it optimizes for that. Um,
Yeah, it kind of sounds like maybe what's happening here is that, we started talking about inequality, and um, this graph of like, okay, as income goes up, quality of life or self-reported happiness, it plateaus. It might be that it's not really about what your income is, but what matters is like what is your income relative to your peers, like what's your
yeah,
social status relative to your peers. And so now that with social media, people are seeing, these ultra billionaires, or maybe even people who are just millionaires who got rich quick, and they were there, they went to high school with them or something, and they're kind of feeling that envy, feeling left behind, and that's causing a lot of problems in society. And I think what you were trying to say was that, um, you know, we're human, and we're gonna feel that. We're gonna feel envy. We're gonna feel psychologically down when we're kind of at the bottom of the bucket, and there's no getting around that. Is that kind of what you one of the things you're trying to say?
yeah. I think even defining it in terms of envy is taking an individualist view of it, but you could define it in terms of envy, but
Hmm.
you could also just define it in terms of um, belonging.
Hmm.
So already using the term envy, you get this idea of like what wealthy people within capitalism tend to call class envy. So it's kind of if neoliberalism is a pejorative term for this view of the economy, class envy is a pejorative for the fact that some people are suffering a lot more. And when they say that's not fair, you say, oh, look, this is envy,
Hmm.
right? Where there is another framework, if instead of looking at individuals and individual motive, we say, well, humans just as a species going way back exist in community. In fact, developmentally, humans compared to other mammals, we have a lot less built-in innate behavior. We are very formed by our community, right?
Hmm.
If we look at this,
Yes,
we
yes.
talk about nature versus nurture. Humans
Yeah.
as mammals are very flexible to this, the to nurture, and so capitalism acts as if humans again optimize at an individual level, but and treat it as a defect if we are concerned with our relation to others. It almost like we almost have a belittling view of the human need for connection with others, as if that's just an unfortunate glitch. And humans
Hmm.
really should just be able to consume stuff until they're happy. And look, you have more stuff than you used to. Why compare to anyone else? When maybe the reality is closer to humans just exist to thrive with a sense with belonging. And where there's income inequality, you create like you are pulling apart um a sense of belonging.
Hmm.
And there is a let's even say, okay, some people are wealthy, you're not as wealthy, but you still have again all these consumer choices that someone 200 years ago wouldn't have. You're way better off than them.
Yeah.
Compared to them, you should be happy, right? That kind of argument.
Yeah.
um we're just going to live in different worlds. We live in the wealthy world, you live in the poor world, but your objective level is better than the objective level of the past. But even that idea that we just live in worlds isn't how it works. There is social shame put on being poor, right? So we can say you should just be objective, but even that is a falsification.
Yeah.
It is so uncommon to talk to wealthy people who don't disdain poor people. So it's not just that you have objectively different levels. There is a condescension, a malice, an antagonism.
Hmm.
And I could say, oh, wealthy people just need to be more mindful. But it comes back to, again, we are biologically human, and there are tendencies that no matter how much you want to say they shouldn't be there,
Hmm.
they are tendencies. Now, what's encouraging is we are able to be nurtured. Societies are able to be nurtured to be more compassionate than other societies. And we can just look through history, compare societies, and see that something like the Spartan society is very brutal, and societies now are more compassionate. So there is a lot of room to have more or less compassionate humans, but there also are, that is conditioned on the structures we live within. So it's not just that an individual can become all these things they want to be. We're formed within our societies, and different economic systems are going to structure how we're formed differently. And so if you want the benefit of all these goods being produced and it creates inequality, but you want to then say, oh, well, you have all this stuff, so you should just be happy. Well, that same system that spread out those goods creates contempt for the poor. Because if the system allocates goods based on your merit, then if you don't have a lot, clearly you didn't merit a lot. And so there is almost a justification for disdain. And now, as humans, there is a reality that words matter. We can say sticks and stones break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But that's just like a coping mechanism for the reality that words can hurt us way more than even physical things. A lot of times. The way a parent treated us growing up can affect us more than breaking a leg on a ski trip, right? And so when you have this inequality, there's always psychological like pressure and harm being done. And so that's why you can't just say, well, compare yourself to someone in the past. Well, that person in the past isn't the one mocking me and my family and treating me as less than human. It is the current rich and wealthy who justify why they should have so much more than me while my aunt can't get treatment at the hospital, right? So we have to get into the realities. It almost flips, it reverses the question. So when I would just defend capitalism, I would always be saying, oh, well, that's so subjective. You're just talking about subjective things and not just the objective reality. But the truth is I was defending a philosophy, not an objective reality. When you dive into the objective reality, it's not just that, oh, well, there's rich and there's poor, and the poor are better off than those in the past, but it's that the current rich live generally with disdain for those who are currently poor. So it's not just that there's a difference in goods. There really is an antagonism that is felt and experienced. And so there's a lot more going on in the reality that can't just be measured by GDP or profit motive or a measure of goods consumed. There's a lot more going on that isn't factored into that. And even if someone personally doesn't have antagonism towards the poor, they still have to deal with, they can be frustrated. Like, why are there riots in the street when there's these injustices? Like, why are these things happening? And it's like, well, even if you feel neutral about the causes and you're just saying, look, I just want to live in a society that's better, like that isn't this torn apart. It's like you in capitalism, you can't buy a better society. So maybe it's worth it to you, even though you aren't the one to materially benefit from a more just society, you get the benefit of living in a more just society. So these other things that stress you out and that you don't like about your society, debates over gender or race or class, maybe it's worth it for you, even if your material consumer options go down, to have the benefit of living in a society where those clashes don't happen, even if you think those clashes are unreasonable. Even let's say you're taking a more conservative stance and you're saying race and gender issues are being exaggerated, but it's like, you know what? Maybe it's still better for you to live in a system where, because there is a more level playing field, these antagonisms don't exist, or don't exist to the same degree. I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but it's saying even if you aren't the one to materially benefit, you benefit by these issues not being as prominent, even if you don't think those issues are legitimate.
No, I understand what you're saying, and I think it'll be good for us to think about that going forward. I wanted to thank you so much just for your time, and this was like really, intellectually stimulating. I learned a lot, and I think maybe next time we can talk about the pros and cons of socialism. And I think about those alternatives.
It's a lot harder because there's not as many we talk about examining realities, and what we end up with is mixed economies, and that's something that's interesting to go into. So an alternative to capitalism as we know it in America is mixed economies, and we can get into other first world countries that
Yeah.
have stronger regulations and like restrict the market more, and that would be an interesting discussion on the pros and cons of a mixed economy. You're going to see
Another.
people saying pros and cons of like Leninist, Marxism. There's of course people who do believe in that, but I feel like historically that it's kind of absurd and hard to
Mhm,
defend something like a planned market. But there's still lots of room for variation that's not communism, that has
mhm.
socialist principles of distributing goods. So
Yeah, I also just was introduced recently to concepts of anarchism, and there's actually capitalist forms of anarchism, and
yeah,
there's more socialist forms of anarchism, and
yeah,
so I think, like you've been kind of reiterating, is that the point is to start thinking about the possibilities and the trade-offs and um, some of these pros and cons, and where do we really want to go from here? I think that's given where we are um, now, where do we go from here? And I
yeah.
think that'll be I think a discussion for a next time. But thank you so
Yeah.
much, Jonathan,
All
for
right.
all your
Thank you.
insights.
Yeah, I know we wandered all over, so sorry about that, but
No need to apologize. I think that's part of the something that's invaluable about discussion is that we have to it's like a living thing. We have to keep
mm,
learning and growing through taking these branches, and sometimes I think we stumble upon things that we make connections that we maybe didn't make before. And so I think that
yeah,
yeah, it does take time, but luckily we have time. So
yeah.
all right.
Thank you, Daniel.